Hi, this is Eric Hess of the Encrypted Economy. In early December 2019, FireEye discovered that a threat actor had compromised SolarWinds' network monitoring program used by multiple federal agencies, including U.S. Treasury, Homeland Security, Departments of State and Energy, and the National Nuclear Security Administration, as well as 100 technology companies. The scope of this attack is still being investigated, and the Biden administration announced recently that they would be taking executive action to address the security shortcomings that this attack uncovered. What the SolarWinds attack demonstrates is that no organization is immune from cybersecurity compromises. The timing of this initiative coincides with the Federal Department of Defense's Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. It's an acronym. There's a bunch of them in this episode. It's a framework that's being ramped up for adoption across multiple government agencies, their vendors, possibly their vendors' vendors, and so on. In short, it is likely to become the new cybersecurity standard across both the government and private sectors. There are levels 1 through 5, depending on the sensitivity of the data or the organization, 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. Today we have John Verry, the founder of Pivot Point Security, on the show to talk about the challenges of managing third-party security risks, which this relates to, as well as the CMMC framework. In this space, there's always a lot of acronyms, so it's hard to have a discussion about the frameworks without delving into them. So for starters, we talk about NYSDFS, which is the New York State Department of Financial Services. It comes up because they issued cybersecurity standards mandated for all financial services companies in its jurisdiction. We talk about HIPAA, or the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and that is the federal law that protects personal health information, also known as PHI. You'll hear about DFARS, because the Department of Defense is the one that promulgated CMMC, and DFARS is the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. It's a set of restrictions for the origination of raw materials that's designed to protect the U.S. defense industry from the vulnerabilities of being dependent on foreign sources of supply. You're also going to hear references to NIST and ISO, as well as SOC audits. I know, lots of acronyms. NIST is the current federal government framework and guidelines that's also adopted by the private sector. They've been extremely prolific in the guidance that they've offered. ISO is the international standard for best practice information security management systems. Stay with me. SOC is a bit different, as it's an attestation by an auditor, usually a CPA firm, that a firm has certain business processes and security controls in place. A SOC 2 report would be the one that covers cybersecurity. Now, lots of acronyms, but they are significant for organizations that are looking to strengthen and demonstrate their cybersecurity controls. Over the next 5 years, they're only going to become more important. And it's going to be harder for you as listeners, as a professional, particularly if you have operational control, to not know what they represent. So don't look to this episode to tell you what you need to do to secure your organization. There's other podcasts for that, and maybe we'll have an episode that covers it at a later time. But it does get into the standards that are likely to impact organizations in the encrypted economy, as well as the issues that companies are going to have to grapple with, particularly as security data and systems become a higher national priority. So with that backdrop, I bring you John Verry, founder of Pivot Point Security. And of course, if you like the show, please leave us a review, share it with your friends, and help us get the word out. Thank you. Welcome to the Encrypted Economy, where we look at the business of, regulation, and security for all things encrypted, digital assets, blockchain technology, privacy, and smart contracts. Hope you'll join us while we explore these forces that are shaping the economy. So this is Eric Hess with the Encrypted Economy. I'm excited today to have John Verry of Pivot Point Security on the show. John is the owner of the business, which he's built up over a number of years. And I was looking at his profile before, and I saw that he also went to Stevens. So New Jersey boy, at least from the college, seems a great place. Welcome to the show, John.
Actually, not a Jersey boy, not originally. And I did notice that your cell phone begins with a 646, which is a Long Island area code, which is where I'm actually from. Actually, a Long Island boy. Originally, I went to college in Jersey and met a girl, and the rest was I've been in New Jersey ever since.
Okay, there you go. So I was wrong. Good start.
It was a logical guess.
It was a logical guess. I saw
It made
Stevens. I
sense.
just went to it. I
Yeah,
love
there you
Stevens.
go.
So, John, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I'm an engineer, and I think anybody who knows me knows that. I look at things very analytically, a lot of numbers, a lot of logic in the way that we look at things, and kind of served me well from a information security perspective, as well as from a business perspective. Have been doing what I'm doing now for roughly 20, 21 years, fully focused on information security, information assurance, in short, helping organizations that need to prove they're secure and compliant do so. Before that, I had a very interesting journey through lots of crazy areas. I was lucky enough to do a lot of work with Carl Zeiss. They were a fantastic West German optical manufacturer, lenses and binoculars and things of that nature. But I did a lot of work with their microscopy groups. I ended up doing some fascinating work for a number of years that I really enjoyed, working with people like Art Ashkin, who received a Nobel Prize for his work on laser tweezers, and I helped him with the optics relating to that. And Dr. David Stoloff at Ethicon, he pioneered the concept of radiokeratometry, which is what became LASIK surgery. So I got to work on that kind of stuff and got to go into clean rooms wearing the suits. And for a guy like me who's intensely curious and an engineer, seeing the kind of like behind the scenes, I did a lot of work in like Nabisco's manufacturing facilities. So I'd go in and help them figure out why the back pressure in the saltine packaging thing would get so high that all of a sudden there'd be these fountains of crackers shooting up in the air, and the response team would come and somehow get this belt working again. And these 300, like literally a football field long oven with just cracker after cracker coming out and automatically going into stuff. So it was a blast. I really enjoyed it and really enjoy what I do now as well.
And do you think that experience or those experiences shaped your methodology for information security?
That's a really cool question. I think we are the sum total of who we've been as people, and I think it would be hard for that not to influence it. I do think that just fundamentally that my background has me take a very reasoned, more methodical, more data-oriented approach to solving problems.
I also note that on a lot of your podcasts, you often start off with a question as to what somebody's favorite drink is. And you're actually very good at sort of going back and forth on the various beverages that are chosen. So I'm not going to ask you what your drink of choice is, because I feel like I'd be stealing your question, but I'll frame it differently. It seems like you're like, just going through it, my investigative powers here, that you're a bourbon, probably slightly more Scotch guy. Is that?
No, well, bourbon, absolutely not Scotch. So you didn't do enough investigation. Anybody who mentions that they're a Scotch drinker, that's my first thing is,
well, I didn't say
why would
Pete.
you ruin whiskey? Definitely, I should say Scotches in general. I'm not enough of an aficionado to argue a point, but most Scotches that I've ever tried, which is not a lot, tend to have peat in them. And for some reason, Pete horribly disagrees with me.
Oh, you haven't tried enough Scotches then. Is bourbon your drink of choice?
I would say that I'm an equal opportunity drinker. Yeah, I'm a huge bourbon guy. I enjoy red wine during the winter quite often. Just both health benefits plus just it's great for sitting by a fire. I'm a stout and darker beer drinker, but I also love a good Belgian. I love a good bourbon barrel aged stout.
All right. So usually I take that question and ask about a single event that shaped somebody's values, worldview, or otherwise. But we've replaced that with a discussion of alcohol. So
it's really interesting. So we started to do that just because what I was trying to do is get people comfortable, because people get amped up when they're coming on a podcast.
You have Pivot Point Security. You've developed a number of clients. I note that a lot of them are in government, as well as a number of small to mid-sized firms. What's your client base? Like, how does it break up?
Really good question. So for the most part, we tend to spend our time in SMBs or SMEs. I don't know what the right definitions are, but it's not unusual for us to be working in, like yesterday, I spent a lot of time on the phone with two of our newer clients or potential newer clients that are 10, 15 people, venture-backed startups, software as a service. We do a lot of work in the software as a service vertical. So it might be companies that small, because it really no longer matters how big your company is. It matters how big your customers are. Because big customers have high security requirements, and they no longer care that you're a 10-person company. You need to have an equivalent security posture to them in order for them to give you your data. So that's where it gets interesting. So I'd say that we probably spend about 80% of our time in companies between a dozen people and 5,000 people. And then we probably spend 20% of our time in companies bigger than that, maybe a little bit more than that, 25%. And we have some, City of New York, we hold a backdrop services contract to do security for them. And that's 400,000 people. So we're comfortable in the bigger environments, but I'll be honest with you, I prefer working in SMBs and SMEs. In bigger organizations, you're there to serve a greater master and you're more disposable. And I don't think you're valued quite as much. When you work in the SMBs and the SMEs, you're looked at as an important extension of those teams. And I think it's a much nicer place to work. And I think that our consultants really partner with our clients. And I think we develop really long-standing, wonderful relationships. I can't tell you how many of our customers I would call very friendly with. I'm not saying I'm fraternizing or socializing with them, but they're people I've worked with for years and really have a strong relationship with.
And I've always had a theory about the larger enterprises that basically you're going to be hired for a specific task, a specific job. Once you start getting into that size, I guess there are companies that would get the overarching, but once you have a CISO, there's a CISO's job to get the tools of the trade, to hire a multitude of different partners and to assign various tasks to them. Whereas with a small to medium-sized enterprise, it's more of a holistic relationship. And it also allows you to centralize the information and better manage it, as opposed to in a larger enterprise, maybe you're just getting pieces of it, but you don't necessarily know how it connects to the whole. That's a CISO's job.
Exactly. That's another good reason. And again, because, and I think you said it well, because you're assigned a specific task, you're a more replaceable entity. And if the task is over, you're over. Or if they no longer decide that the task is important enough, management cuts budget and third-party risk management has to get by with less resources. If you were helping them with third-party risk management, you're no longer helping them with third-party risk management.
When you're pitching to new prospects, what kind of progression have you seen in attitudes over the years? Speaking from personal experience, I know like when I started doing this initially in 2011, there was a lot of kick the can down the road. People they wanted to talk to you. They wanted to have you on the bench. And if it's a regulated industry, and if something happened, they want to be able to call you up and say, hey, can you come on? And then it's evolved. It's continued to evolve. And I think to the point where you see a lot more companies that were formerly just MSPs teaming up with bigger organizations and going into the cybersecurity business, but not necessarily having that deep understanding, much like the kind that you have in your business. Do you want to comment on that?
You just, that is one big apple to bite that you just brought up, because you really,
Podcast.
I know, but that's a tough one to unpack because, so let's take the first part of that, because you talked about MSPs. So what we've seen, if you go back, you've been in the game for a long time, you've been a technologist a long time, as I have been. There was a day when, your IT folks all worked for you. I know that sounds strange to some of the people that are listening, but it used to be, you used to employ your own IT operation. And then sometime 15-ish years ago, 20, and probably 20 years ago, because I know the MSP Alliance was started in 2000. So it's probably that relative time frame. People started outsourcing selectively certain parts of their IT operations. So you couldn't afford to get an Exchange admin. So you'd say, I'll hire an Exchange admin as an outsourced body. And then that worked out pretty well. So maybe we'll do server maintenance that way. Okay, now we'll do break fix that way. And let's fast forward to 2021. And what percentage of an SMB or SMEs actually have full-time IT staff that do all of their functions? Very few, right? Most organizations are relying on an MSP. So what we've seen, which is a logical evolution of that, is MSPs want to be single throat to choke. MSPs want to make money. So they've bitten off more and more of the apple. So that's impacted us quite a bit, because in the old days, I'll go back to 2005 when we were doing pen testing. Normally the phone call came in from a CIO or an IT director or somebody of that nature, because he got a requirement to do a pen test from the board or a requirement to do a pen test from a vendor. And I don't know who to call. He'd look on the internet, he'd call us, and we'd do a pen test for him. Now what happens is the IT director is now an MSP. So the management comes to them and say, we need a pen test. And they say, okay, we'll do it. Or we've got a partner that will do it. And that's where you started to see organizations move from being what I would refer to as MSPs to MSSPs, right? So where they're blending the IT operations with the security operations. I think there's benefits from an end user perspective. So if I owned a company, hey, this is great. I got one throat to choke. I can call Eric up. Eric's MSP is this great group of people, and they're doing my information security and my information technology. That's the positive view of it. The negative view is that we have a fox in the henhouse. And we got guys that are implementing the controls and they're directing the implementation of the controls, and then they're governing the operation of the controls. So if anything fails there, you have no belt and suspenders, and you end up with ransomware, or you end up with a breach. As you might imagine, and I fully understand there's somewhat of a self-serving attitude here. Our recommendation is, look, MSPs are great. You should use an MSP if you don't want to hire your own folks. but I think you have to be cautious and careful about how much security they do. I think security implementation, not a problem, because if you've got somebody who's directing the strategy and specifying what should be implemented, and or somebody who is validating the effective operation of it that's independent of that implementation, I think we're in a good spot. So I think that's the best way to work with that. And I think that's a lot of what's influenced our conversations. I think the second thing which has influenced our conversations increasingly is most people don't decide on Monday morning that I need to become more secure because they want to become more secure. They usually decide they want to become more secure because they have to. There's a government regulation or there's a client contractual obligation. So
or
you're
they
a
got
lawyer.
hacked.
Yeah, or they got hacked, that's true. And you're a lawyer, right? So you're familiar with the term outside counsel guidelines. You're familiar with business associate agreements, data privacy addendums. You're familiar with security questionnaires and dealing with all that. So typically that's where we're getting the phone call. And then one thing we're also seeing, echoing the same arc that we saw with IT, we're starting to see the same thing from security perspective. Hey, we outsourced IT. Can we outsource security? So we see that in the MSPs, and we're even starting to see it now at the management level and the more second tier strategic levels. Like, hey, do I really need a data privacy officer? Or can I outsource that? Do I really need a chief security officer? Or can I outsource that? Can I outsource my vendor risk management? So that's the other thing we're seeing.
I think one thing I've learned about vendor risk management is there's not that much of a market for tools for vendor risk management as much as there's a market for services backing tools for vendor risk management. You sell somebody a tool for vendor risk management, it can be very complex. And the first question, I know Prevalent went through this. They spent a lot of money building their systems. And then what they found is when they went out to everybody was like, okay, that's great. Can you do it? And it was just like, but we have this tool and we want to scale. And it's, yeah, but that's great. I don't want to spend the time learning it. You're the expert. You do it. But we're not built as a consulting organization. And I think that was part of the reason why they ended up restructuring. And that's just one example, but certainly a notable one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the problem, and we saw this with all of the tools, I'm a certified third-party risk professional. We've got 3 of them on staff. We've got certified third-party risk auditors on staff. So third-party risk management is something we know an awful lot about. We're very active in the shared assessment community. The challenge with this is that a tool's great, but a tool has to be configured per your plan. You need a vendor risk management policy, you need a plan, you need procedures to deal with if a vendor fails vendor risk management, right? What do we do? Do we have an exception policy? Do we have a policy about how long we'll let them clean up certain things? So a tool without a policy and plan is nothing. And that's really why so many of the tools have struggled a bit. The other problem with third-party risk management, which is dreadful, and there's no easy solution to it, is like we have a client that's a consulting organization. They've got 35,000 vendors. How do you do vendor risk management on 35,000 vendors? And how comprehensive a review do you do? I mean,
risk weighted.
Yeah, okay, but risk weighted. So there's the question. But still, here's the problem. People can't afford to do vendor risk management. So what happens is they take massive risks. I know an organization that just recently, they're trying to get their cost per vendor review down to the lowest amount possible, a low price to do a vendor risk management review, fully automated, outsourcing to a lower cost area, right? The Philippines, India, places of that nature. If you can get your cost per review for a medium or high vendor down to $1,200, you're thrilled. And that's hard to do. If you're going to do it onshore with good people and do it in a more comprehensive way, it's not unusual for it to cost $3,000, $4,000.
You've seen the rise of these organizations that aggregate the vendor risk reviews so that you can just tap into what somebody else did. Of course, that doesn't really get into specific use cases. It doesn't, exactly. What they answer for one doesn't necessarily apply to you. And that's really where it's good to know their overall posture. But depending on the sensitivity of the data, that's a check the box. And who's reviewing that and who's following up on it? Are they just collecting it and saying, hey, I have it on my files? And what are the risks that you note? And I'll note them too. Or is there any kind of review? And when I say risk weighting before, it's tongue in cheek because risk weighting, somebody else has to administer to that. Like, how do you risk weight 35,000 vendors? Oh, okay, thank you. I'll now spend 2 years doing that.
Well, the thing which is crazy, you have 35,000 vendors. Right? So clearly you've got thousands of permutations of risk there. What data they have access to, what mechanisms they have access to the data through, and what laws and regulations the different types of data are subject to, the quantity of data that they have access to. Think about all the permutations. And now what will happen is, how many questionnaires do most organizations have? 3. Logically, vendor risk management is broken. And I'd love to tell you that I have an answer for it, but I really don't. Supply chain risk management's a huge issue for the next 20 years.
So In one of your shows, you segmented clients and I guess it's prospects and the challenges that they face. There's three buckets: those who buy a product but don't know how to implement it; organizations that are just framework focused, which I don't know if is a problem necessarily if you have the technical solutions behind it; and number three is technical solution based organizations, which isn't a problem if you have a framework behind it.
And I can think of one guy in particular that I think is comical, and he's in a huge organization. But his answer, if you say to him, "What's your security strategy?" He starts spooling off all the products that he's bought, and they're tied to like the Gartner Magic Quadrants. You can go down the list and use a Gartner subscriber. And the funny thing is, he goes to the board, and that's his answer to everything. And it doesn't matter that they haven't resourced the right people to run the tools. They don't matter that they haven't been configured properly. It doesn't matter that not only do they have knowledge gaps, but they have coverage gaps. They've got monitoring gaps, so they've got tools that are not being properly managed, or they've got multiple panes of glass instead of getting everything back. They never really truly operationalize any of the tools. Like we ended up going in there to do some testing of an environment. It was comical. It was a super high risk environment. They are like, oh, this is just a dot the I's exercise. We scan this environment once a week, which is really a lot to scan an environment for vulnerabilities once a week. So we're thinking, okay, it's going to be a clean pen test. A minute into the pen test, we're like, these guys don't scan this environment every week. This is a crap show. Like we chew up the environment, we gain all kinds of access. And the guy's like, I don't understand how this could possibly happen. He's yelling at his people. So we take on a little extra effort. So we log into their Qualys console to look to see what kind of scanning they're doing. And we realize that they've checked a little box that says enable fast scanning. And we're like, you know what that box does? Well, you don't scan all of the 65,535 ephemeral ports. You actually only scan in the top like 100. So you've been running your scans for years wrong. And that's an example of a product focused guy. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're trying to figure out security, and you either think you should go to the market and buy up something for each one of those things people tell you about, don't do that. Or if you're working with a vendor that the answer to every security question is a product, you're working with the wrong people. The answer to most security questions is process, procedure, policy. They don't know how to implement the product until you establish a policy. Management's policy is promulgation of intent, right? What I want you to do. So until you define that, they can't figure out, do they need a product or not? And they can't figure out how to implement the product. So that was that side of it. And then I think on the framework focused, I think what I was referring to there is that you could be framework focused in two ways, and I don't remember the conversation. So we can be framework focused, which I think is the positive way, which is, hey, we're going to align our security program with, and usually the two frameworks are going to be the NIST framework or the ISO framework, which is really just well-vetted, well-documented guidance to ensure that you've got a comprehensive approach to information security and an answer to any question that you have. Do I have to worry about this? Well, yeah, the framework says, yeah, you should consider how you authenticate people and whether multi-factor authentication should be in place, or you need to have something to log. You should have some level of independent, objective validation of things on a periodic basis. It gives you all that good guidance to know that, hey, this is how I architect a program. So that's the positive side of a framework focus. I think the negative side of a framework focus, and we see, is where organizations say, hey, I have to comply with New York State DFS 500, or I have to comply with HIPAA. And they look at that as being the sum total of we're secure now. I implemented, or we're a medical organization, we implemented HIPAA. HIPAA only cares about PHI, right? You have credit card data in your environment. So that HIPAA validation has nothing to do with your credit card data. It has nothing to do with controls that live outside of that. So I think that's where the negative of being framework focused would be. And then the technical solutions oriented, my guess is what I was thinking about at that point, or talking about at that point, is that you have some people that come to information security from a heavy IT background. And there's a particular framework that I think works really well for them, and that's the Center for Internet Security Controls, their critical security controls. It used to be called the SANS Top 20. It's a great set of a simple approach to information security. So if you're a deep dive tech admin, a guy that's got bits and bytes under his fingernails every day, and somebody says you need to become more secure and you can't afford to hire somebody like Eric or us, grab a copy of the CIS CSC. It's an open standard, and it's going to appeal to a technology person, because it's how do you implement technology in a way which is going to align with the greatest amount of risk which needs to be mitigated. And it's a very technical approach to security. My guess is that's what I was referring to in that podcast.
Yeah, and thanks for that. And it's funny, we all come across people who think that just buying the tools gets you to where it needs to be. Probably not as extreme as the example, at least on my side, but it's amazing also the gaps in coverage that gets created with every new tool that you bring in. To the extent you're not implementing it, you have to make sure that they're working together. And if they're not working together, you have a false sense of security, because every single integration, if it's not done correctly, could itself pose a security issue.
And the true cost of a tool is, and I don't know what the exact number is, but it's probably 1/5 of the actual cost of the tool. Right, because then each year you need to pay for the upgrades and things. I mean, like Microsoft Office 365 is a phenomenal environment. Their security and compliance center stuff is amazing. You implement that and say, hey, we should use this. You need somebody who's paying attention to that every day, a decent percentage of the day, just to stay on top of it, just to leverage it. So you've got this investment, you buy a tool, you got to figure out like what percentage of each person's time needs to be involved in monitoring that tool, validating that's working effectively, adapting the tool as your technology changes, adapting the tool as your security requirements change, adapting the tool as you do business with new customers, adapting the tool as you put data in different cloud environments. If you implement Alien Vault, great tool. You implement Alien Vault and suddenly you decide to move some stuff into Azure. You've got a whole project to make sure that Alien Vault is still monitoring that. You add a new application to your environment. So the care and feeding of this stuff is a bear, and people really underestimate the ongoing cost of it and the ongoing level of effort.
And then sometimes even I've seen situations where people get too much technology, and when things don't work together, somebody in IT will just turn it off because it's just, it was blocking me from getting into this program, so we shut it off. And it's okay, now that's such a problem. If the people who are managing it don't even understand and they're not coordinating and you don't have enough expertise in it, to your point, they're running Qualsys, they're doing a marginal scan. They're probably telling the board and everybody else that they're secure and they're doing it. But meanwhile, they're wide open vulnerable.
Yeah, that false sense of security is an absolute danger. And I do think tools have a tendency to create false sense of security. Certainly in management needs to go to the people that are looking to buy tools or implement tools, and they need to say, hey, talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old child. Until I understand everything that's going to happen here, until you stop with the bits and bytes, stop with the acronyms. And until they get to that point, they're at a loss to know whether or not. So that management doesn't realize that they've got a gap. And then unfortunately, I think sometimes the people themselves don't know they have a gap. They turn on or off a feature. Like they had no idea. Management truly thought, the guy directly responsible for doing the scans and the people that were his bosses and his bosses absolutely thought that they were 100% covered. They were shocked.
So you've also done a lot of work with regards to CMMC. Do you want to tell us about what CMMC is and how it interrelates with NIST and ISO 27001 or 27001?
Mm-hmm. You hear it said both ways. Yeah, CMMC is going to go down, I think, in InfoSec history is perhaps the most significant standard of all time. That might sound like hyperbole, and it is, but I actually think it might actually be. So CMMC started life as, it's called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And CMMC started life because in 2015, the Defense Industrial Base, or the DoD, said, hey, we've got 350,000 odd companies in our defense industrial base, our defense supply chain. And we need to make sure that they're properly protecting data because we're bleeding. I think the number is $650 million worth of intellectual property every year because they're not very secure. To that, the F-35, I think it was called, jet, which it took us 15 years and $1 billion to build. The Chinese were flying one that looks remarkably like it down to wingtip dimensions 2 years later. So they said, this isn't good. So in 2015, roughly, they came out with something called NIST SP 800-171, which was mandated by a DFARS clause. The DCMA runs the budget and purchasing, Defense Contract Management Association, and there are these clauses called DFARS. And it said, hey, you need to prove you're secure to us. And the way we're going to ask you to prove you're secure is comply to this NIST SP 800-171, and that's the 110 good security practices that should protect what we call CUI, controlled unclassified information. So the way that they were going to prove it is you were going to get a piece of newspaper or lunch bag and get a crayon and put an X on it and send it to us. And now we'll know you're actually doing what you're doing.
Sounds like a good system.
Yeah, shockingly, it didn't work. There was no enforcement. It was fully like honor system.
Maybe it was the wrong crayon.
Yeah, they should use marker because that's permanent. A crayon you can erase.
So self-attestation.
Yes, exactly. That's the fancy word for it. Yep. So that didn't work. They said, we're going to up the game a little bit, and we're basically going to make you be subject to a third-party audit to validate that you're implementing these controls. And while we're doing that, why don't we make this a little bit more robust? So why don't we give you a CMMC level 1 option, which is good for what we call federal contract information, which is information that doesn't rise to the same level of treatment or risk as CUI, but still needs to be protected. And that's what CMMC level 1 is, and it covers 17 controls which are necessary to do that. We'll take CUI and we'll still hold it to 800-171, but we're going to add a few more controls to it. So we went from 110 controls to 130 controls. But we're going to have a more formal way that we look at the processes necessary to ensure that those practices are being properly implemented. That's where the maturity concept comes in. So now we're up to 130 controls and 51 processes that we look at, or 130, they call them practices or controls. And then we'll also add a level 5, and that's going to be for really super high risk systems. Think about space stuff, think about munitions. And that's a level 5, and that's up to 171 controls, with the big difference being that the 41 additional controls are largely focused on what we call advanced persistent threat. So that's CMMC in a nutshell. And where now it's getting even more interesting. So you say to yourself, okay, 350,000 organizations, the rough number is probably 40 or 50,000 of them probably fall into CMMC level 3. Well, to put that in perspective, we probably have 40 or 50,000 ISO 27001 certificates in the world that have been issued since 2005. So now you're saying, hey, we're going to have the same number of organizations have to comply with a similarly complex standard in a 4-year, 5-year period. So that's why it's such a big deal. And here's where it gets bigger. So the bigger is that CUI is defined by NARA, National Archives and Records Association. And CUI is not just DoD data. Student information is CUI, and lots of other data that we operate on every day. So any agency that has CUI is suddenly going, we could use this. So now what happens is, so we heard talk about OCIE and SEC using this. So there's open talk about it being used as part of the Sarbanes-Oxley program, which would mean that every public company would have some level of CMMC going on. Department of Homeland Security was quoted last week as saying they're going to issue contracts this year that are going to require CMMC. And then lastly, well, not lastly, last week, if you're familiar with FERPA, which is the standard which applies to student records or CUI. So all of the institutes of higher education have been put on notice that you should start looking at NIST SP 800-171 and CMMC, because we're going to start using that. And then lastly, and perhaps most important, GSA, the Government Services Administration, which is the entity that procures most IT services for the federal agencies, included it in their Polaris contract explicitly. So anyone who's going to bid to be an MSP, an IT services provider, provide IT services to the government, in theory, is going to need to be conformant with. So that's where I look at this thing and say, holy shite, where is this going?
And it's interesting because it seems that the organizations that would be covered, the contractors who are servicing the government, they also have vendors. And so it starts to really trickle downstream, because if they have to comply with CMMC, the vendors that serve them presumably also have to satisfy or have to map to those controls that they're trying to achieve on their side.
That's an excellent point, and that's another reason where this gets nutty. So what happens is that, so this is, at least in the DoD, right, which is where we have the actual laws and regulations that have been issued. So under DFARS, they've added 3 new clauses, 70, 19, 20, and 21. And specifically in those clauses, they obligate you to verify that anybody that you're sharing the information with, any downstream vendors, right, anyone in your supply chain, is adhering to the same standard. So like you said, now, so you got 300,000 at this level, but they all have 3 people. And then those 3 people each have 2 people. And suddenly you've got every, mom and pop, you've got the corner bodega needs a CMMC certificate. The implications are absolutely nutty.
And is SolarWinds driving this narrative more, or not really? It was being driven well before SolarWinds and hasn't changed.
Yeah. So I think what SolarWinds will do, CMMC came into the broad stream narrative probably a year and a half ago, where you started to really hear about it. So this is not a reaction at all to SolarWinds.
But is it accelerating it?
I think every major breach that creates that level of awareness is going to accelerate people's concerns with regards to the security of their information when they share it with a third party. So I think it would be crazy to say it's not impacting it or accelerating it. I think what it's going to do is put an increased level of emphasis on the supply chain, this validation. So if I was going in to audit an organization, I think based on the fact that SolarWinds is so prevalent on people's minds, and the requirement is there, I think I would probably dig a little deeper into their third-party risk management processes and confirm that they've truly done their due diligence with their vendors. So yeah, I think if you're a third-party risk management person, I do think CMMC is going to have a positive impact on your business.
And if you're an accounting firm and you're doing SOC 1, SOC 2, SSAE 16, 18, whatever the number is that gets released in the near future, are those firms now going to be mapping directly to CMMC controls?
So now you're into another really interesting tidbit here. So recently, Katie Arrington, who's, I forget her exact title, she's effectively the lead dog, if you will.
Right. And I'm going to do a little virtual CISO promo here. Kate Arrington was on John Verry's show, so you might also want to check that out.
Kate Arrington is fantastic. She's a patriot. She's done a tremendous amount with this program, and I tip my hat to her. What was I saying? Now you totally
I should have done the promo. We were talking about SOC 1, SOC 2.
Oh, okay. So now you're into a really interesting. So Kate Arrington recently said that they're looking at reciprocity. And she specifically mentioned under reciprocity, FedRAMP and ISO 27001. We don't know exactly what that means because there's a lot of areas. She did not mention reciprocity to SOC 2. It might have been an oversight. They might be planning it. So there's an interest is what is exactly going to reciprocity mean? There's another implication which is really interesting to me, right? Because we make the bulk of our money helping organizations get ready to prepare for and maintain ISO certification, SOC 2, attestations, FedRAMP, high trust, those types of standards, CMMC. So if your helical organization, decided was going to do work for somebody in the DIB and you got CMMC level 3 certified, now I come to you and say, I want you to be ISO certified or SOC 2 certified. What's the first thing you're going to say is, hey, I'm already CMMC level 3, which is equal to, arguably, or pretty damn close or better than, right? I think we can make arguments both ways. If I offered you, generally speaking, if I offer you an ISO certificate, a SOC 2 certificate, or I offered you a CMMC, wouldn't you largely accept all three of those as being pretty indicative that I've got a good security posture?
Presumably, unless there was a requirement, presumably rebuttable, that it has to be a SOC 2 audit.
Right. So that's what I think is going to happen. I think that once a company's got a CMMC level 3, I think they're going to say, wait a second, I'm not going out and getting another ISO or a SOC 2. I do think if you look forward N years, where N is probably more than 2 and less than 5, I think that you're going to see CMMC level 3, if it goes on the arc it is right now, reducing the number of companies that get ISO 27001 certified or SOC 2 attested.
You would hope, right?
Unless you're a CPA firm.
Right.
Because that's a lot of their revenue, right? A lot of CPA firms, their SOC 2 business is a huge part of their revenue stream.
Right. I know that there's always new standards coming out too. There's one called a FAIR framework now. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I'm not passing judgment on it. I haven't looked at it in great depth. It's another continuous maturity model. And with a lot of these frameworks, I think it gets confusing. You can sit there and you can map NIST to ISO. If you comply with NIST, somebody says to me, hey, are you ISO compliant? As long as I know how to do certification, I'm like, it's NIST, okay? It's largely compatible. We can map the controls, et cetera, but we might go with NIST because that's what we do more of than ISO. But where does this break? It sounds like CMMC might be sort of pushing that breaking point where companies just say, okay, how many different standards do I have to comply with? How many people do I have to employ to sit there and say, well, it's this control here in ISO, and then there's this one in NIST, and then there's this one in CMMC, and then here's the flow chart on a single control. Okay, here how it maps across all these 10 different controls. Okay, next control, because there could be a lot. On some level, obviously, for HIPAA, for high trust, for FFIEC, for the regulatory-based requirements, frameworks fit into those. But if you have an obligation to comply with specific frameworks with regards to some clients, some governmental organizations, your regulator, where do you see this all going? Because it seems like it's unnecessary at a certain point.
Yes, it's very frustrating. The only thing worse than not enough guidance is too much guidance. And we certainly have too much guidance. To be honest, we make a lot of money because there's too much guidance. Because people come to us and go, I can't keep up with all this crap. Figure it out for me. I work in 3 different verticals and they're asking me for 13 different standards. How do I normalize these? How do I figure out what the high water mark? So that's what we do every day. Where it gets interesting, and this is a ton of conjecture here, right? We're reading tea leaves. But if you think about it logically, to this point, there have been 2 major standards in the world. There's ISO and there's NIST. Those are information security frameworks. And NIST is a US-based centric standard. And ISO is most of the rest of the world. Certainly Europe, Japan, England, Australia, very ISO oriented. So we had these two different complementary but competing frameworks. Then what happened is that we have attestations frameworks. So SOC 2 is an attestation framework. It's not a control framework. It has controls in it, but you probably build your controls using ISO or NIST guidance, right? Just to simplify things. And the reason why the CPA framework they wanted to make sure that the IT systems that were producing financials could be trusted. And that's where SOC 1 rolled in and SOC 2 rolled in, accuracy in financial reporting. So what happened was AICPA is a very important, powerful part. And because they were part of the financial audits and they were already in talking to management, SOC 2 became an alternative attestation framework to ISO 27001 because there wasn't a federal government framework, right? There was no FedRAMP, there was no CMMC. So now where does this go? Well, what percentage of revenue and what percentage of our economy, is tied into the federal government? An inordinate percentage. But if you think about it logically, so many people are going to end up getting the government attestation now that we have one, because by the way, all of this data that we're talking about is considered CUI, right? So right now, HIPAA or the CMS InfoSec program could be totally rejiggered tomorrow to say, oh, we're going to just use CMMC level 3. That would mean every healthcare organization in the country suddenly is looking at their ISO certificate, they look at their high trust certification, they look at their SOC 2 and going, wait a second, I got to comply with this one from the government. So now you have an attestation framework from the government. We've never had an attestation framework from the government. So to me, I think that if you ask me who's in more trouble, ISO or SOC, I'd say SOC, because ISO is outside of our borders. AICPA is inside our borders, and now this competing inside of our borders that's government mandated and government centric. And that's where a lot of people make their money. So I think that that's where SOC 2 is in danger. Where ISO could be in danger, and this gets really interesting, is our weapons programs and our national defense is not solely, we have the NATO alliance, right? And I'm not smart enough to tell you the number. What is it? 7 organizations that are part of NATO. Well, what's happening is in order for those organizations to participate in our food chain, and a lot of those members are members of the defense industrial base and defense supply chain, the NATO alliance is starting to actually was probably going to use CMMC. And if the NATO alliance starts to use CMMC, and most of those NATO alliances are now ISO entities, we may see ISO take a little bit of a backseat to CMMC. If you want to pitch that CMMC is going to become the be-all, end-all, that's the path of it happening.
But if you think about it, unfortunately, there's sort of two different interests at stake, right? So if we talk about SOC 1, SOC 2, we're going to get a little political. So if we're rolling with the premise that CMMC is actually the right framework, it's the one that has emerged based on the history of NIST and ISO, and this is the framework that makes a lot of sense. And I know even on your show, you talked about how, and I'm going on a little bit of a tangent, you talked about how level 1 is actually an excellent framework for small to medium-sized businesses to operate from. And they've really focused on keeping it simpler and more understandable, and it's incorporated prior learnings into it. But when we think about something like SOC, and I know I'll make some enemies with my accounting brethren here, but on the one side, you have sort of a national, arguably, inefficiency, meaning nobody likes to have to get these multiple certifications or comply with multiple frameworks, spend the additional money on SOC, and then also have to comply with the CMMC and get audited there, have to pay out twice. But it is a significant inefficiency. It's a drain on industry that they have to pay. It's a cost of doing business. You're reducing profitability. It has implications for the economy. For those that are doing the audits, they're making money. So on the one side, you have this broader inefficiency. And then on a more concentrated side, you have all these consulting and CPA firms that do have lobbying forces in DC. So I'm going to put you on the spot and you can say, I don't know, but I probably won't accept that. Who wins? What's going to push it over the edge when you have a concentrated group that is actually much more interested in perpetuating the current SOC 1, SOC 2 structure and maybe more resistant to seeing that go away? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
That's a great question.
He's like, damn it, Eric, why couldn't we have just stayed on the other topic, right?
Listen, I got to be honest with you, I love reading tea leaves. I love trying to outsmart the market and kind of get ahead of things. So it's fun to ponder these issues. If I had to venture a guess, most of the CPA firms that I know that make a lot of money doing SOC 2 and SOC 1 and other forms of InfoSec-oriented attestations have always hedged their bet. Most of them do SOC 1, SOC 2. Most of them are ISO registrars. Many of them are FedRAMP 3PAOs. And many of them are in the process of already become C3PAOs. So I think to some extent, they're going to look at this and say, do I really care if I'm charging you 40,000 bucks for a SOC 2 Type 2, or I'm really charging you 40,000 bucks for a CMMC Level 3 certification? As long as I'm the one delivering said certification, and on top of that, they're also very smart in that there will be some industry specific standards that I think, probably are not going away, like payment card industry data security standard, right? There's some uniqueness there. I think that you're never going to have CMMC do a very good job of applying directly to that without some changes, which probably wouldn't be good for CMMC. So they're also QSAs. I think to some extent they're going to I think AICPA is going to be more concerned about SOC 2 losing favor than the actual CPA firms are, because their logical pivot is to become CMMC Level 3, and they're already trusted advisors to the core business people. I think the CPA firms will navigate it well. I think the AICPA will that'll be a fun one to watch.
Interesting. What do you think the forces are that's going to result in industry or the government saying this is a net tax on business, that we don't have a more unified framework, that there's confusion, that they have to sort of map across different ones? And some people say, well, it's not really that big. It's once you map it, it's no big deal. But when you get into things like certifications and the import of that certification, I mean, I guess you could just say you have to certify across ISO, NIST, CMMC, and that's one certification or one audit. But is that the path that it goes, or does it go the path where they basically say we need a CMMC and it just sort of the other ones naturally fall away? Or what's the triggering event that sort of starts to get some more clarity and more standardization around these frameworks?
I think we're in that triggering event. I think CMMC is the triggering event. Now, whether or not it'll actually go to the end game that we discussed, who the heck knows? And I also think there's a complexity to this that will never go away, unfortunately. So, I'd love to tell you that we could get to a point where there was one standard. And realistically, who cares? ISO, CMMC, SOC 2. Let's get to a point where there's one open, trusted standard. Everyone knows how to do it. There's clear and unambiguous guidance. There's a playbook, and we're all more secure. Where I think the complexity comes into play is that technology evolves every day. So as we've migrated to be more cloud enabled, what if your standard is not super cloud oriented and doesn't do a good job of addressing cloud risk? We've got the Internet of Things, which is going to be another amazingly significant change in the world over the next 5-10 years. What we're going to see there, well, IoT risk, embedded technology risk, is radically different than risk to conventional business, although conventional businesses are part of that risk profile and they don't really even know it. Then you've got operational technology, SCADA systems and industrial control systems and smart factories and things of that nature, which are both an IoT risk and a separate operational style risk, which again needs some specific guidance around it. And then the last one, of course, is privacy has become just a bear. We've got GDPR, we've got APAC, we've got the California Consumer Privacy Act. Privacy is different. So we've got to address privacy. I don't know that there'll ever be a one size fits everything standard. I think the question is, can we reduce the number of similar standards and consolidate to one there, so that way these special purpose standards, which are just a natural evolution of evolution, or we've got less to worry about, right? We don't have 50 things we're looking at. We've got 5.
And I think ultimately on the privacy side, we will move toward a federal law. It's in the cards, just a question of when, because various states are going to have to adopt these privacy regulations. People are going to be screaming the same cry, which is, how do I comply with 50 different states?
2 things there. I think you're right for sure, what you just said. And there is a NIST privacy framework. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yep.
That came out last year.
Excellent.
And it aligns with the NIST cybersecurity framework. So I think that, it kind of was built in a way that you can integrate your infosec privacy management programs, which is a really powerful thing. ISO does that with 27001 and 27701. So I think that's really, reading the tea leaves.
I liked what NIST did. That was very prescient of them to do that. Particularly, given that you're just seeing more out of California, which is probably going to, in some ways, set the standard for the rest of the country.
Oh, they always do. I mean, where does all new regulation come out of? Not all, but a lot of it. California SB 314, that was the original breach notification, and then we end up with 50 state standards. Actually, all 50 states now have, Arkansas finally produced a standard 15 years later. So I think every state has a standard now. And California is ahead of the game as well. We talked about IoT and IoT risk. California SB 327 California's a pain in the butt.
But California does have, it's always funny because in contracts, if the other side says choice of law is California, or I mean, they could just as easily say Louisiana, which is under civil law. And the first time I go back to my client is absolutely not. We're not stipping to California law. And it's like, why? Well, because California is like a different country in terms of law. It's just Louisiana is the same thing. It's civil law in Louisiana, but California definitely has more statutes, more pitfalls, and I don't even want to go there. I'm like, I'm not licensed in California. You'd have to get a licensed California attorney to just tell you what you just signed. I can help you if it's based on like Delaware or New York or conventional states, but California, forget about it. There's no way.
Yeah, it's a different beast.
Anyway, John, it's been tremendous to have you on the show. This has been a great conversation.
Cool. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. And we hit a lot, but I think, one of the big takeaways for the people listening is CMMC is an important development in cybersecurity frameworks, meaning how your organization complies versus just a technical solution. It's what you put in place, so overall governance and the framework for executing on that. And John certainly has been doing a hell of a lot in this space and certainly can assist organizations as well. I'm not stumping for him because I don't do that in this podcast, but he does have an expertise in it. So certainly somebody who I'm sure organizations looking at this should talk to. So John, if people want to find out more about you, about Pivot Point Security, which pivotpointsecurity.com, where can they find out? Twitter, social media, anywhere else?
Yeah, we're on all of that stuff. I mean, I think the easiest way, like you said, is reach out, Pivot Point Security or info at Pivot Point Security or John Verry Pivot Point Security or anything. Someone's going to get back to you.
There you go. They got a great podcast, Virtual CISO, that I listen to as well.
So. And I will just put in a little plug here. We have this really intelligent lawyer guy that's going to come on our podcast as well, because I want to chat with him about when do you call your lawyer and when do you call your information security person, and when do you call both? Because really right now, especially with privacy and information security going the direction they are, which direction to go is not often easy to figure out.
I'd be so interested in hearing that one. I'm sure I'd learn a lot. Anyway.
I hope you're interested more than listening to it, because otherwise I got to find a different guest
there you go.
to record it.
I'll listen to it for sure. Anyway, so again, John, thanks so much.
Same here, man. It was good to catch up.